and the selected place from which the assault on the pole was to be made. Peary transferred stores to Cape Columbia, located on the north of the island, and the selected place from which the assault on the pole was to be made. Peary's polar advance commenced in February 1909. Support parties led by Bartlett, Borup, Marvin, McMillan, and Godsell had the task of carrying provisions, establishing a trail, and providing igloos for Peary and Henson, who were to lead the assault on the pole. The support parties turned back. The last to do so was led by Bartlett, who retreated on April 1st, 1909, from latitude 87.47 north. Peary, Henson, and 4 Inuit continued their approach to the pole, which they claimed to reach on April 6th.
4 Inuit. Our original indigenous people.
1909. A Cook-Peary controversy resulted. On September 2nd, 1909.
Cook and Peary get their beef on like a motherfucker back.
Cook published his claim to have reached the pole. Peary's rival claim was submitted 4 days subsequently. So after centuries of unsuccessful, ill-fated attempts at the pole, within the space of just 4 days, 2 American explorers claimed to be the first successes. Cook's journal description of his heroic arrival at the pole reads more like a piece of poetic fiction than an actual experience, however, which has raised questions from skeptics. He wrote, "Constantly and carefully, I watched my instruments in recording this final reach. Nearer and nearer they recorded our approach. Step by step, my heart filled with a strange rapture of conquest. At last, we step over colored fields of sparkle, climbing walls of purple and gold. Finally, under skies of crystal blue, with flaming clouds, we touch the mark. The soul awakens to a definite triumph. There is sunrise within us, and all the world of night-darkened trouble fades. We are at the top of the world. The flag is flung to the frigid breezes of the North Pole. The first realization of actual victory, of reaching my lifetime's goal, set my heart throbbing violently and my brain aglow. I felt the glory which the prophet feels in his vision, with which the poet thrills in his dream. I saw silver and crystal palaces, such as were never built by man.
Nigga sound like you writing Bible verse. Let's get it.
With turrets flaunting pinions glorious golden. The shifting mirages seemed like the ghosts of dead armies, magnified and transfigured, huge and spectral, moving along the horizon and bearing the wind-tossed phantoms of golden blood-stained banners. I was at a spot which was as near as possible, by usual methods of determination, 520 miles from Svartavoag, a spot towards which men had striven for more than 3 centuries, a spot known as the North Pole, and where I stood, first of white men. Peary's journal description of his arrival at the pole.
I had to be the first one to get that, a white man. A white man, as I stood as a white man. Who got you up there? The Inuit, nigga. But you didn't get that, you son of a bitch. Let's get it.
Sounded more down to earth and believable, but doubt would soon be cast over his claims as well. He wrote, "A pole at last, the prize of 3 centuries, my dream and goal for 20 years, mine at last. I cannot bring myself to realize it. It seems all so simple and commonplace. While we traveled, the sky cleared, and at the end of the journey, I was able to get a satisfactory
Damn, his picture ain't got no snow in the motherfucker. He on dirt.
series of observations at Columbia Meridian.
Nigga on the moon.
Midnight. These observations indicated that our position was then beyond the pole. In a march of only a few hours, I had passed from the western to the eastern hemisphere and had verified my position at the summit of the world. It was hard to realize that on the first miles of this brief march, we had been traveling."
So the pole separates the east from the north, and the east from the west. East from the west, America from Europe. All this shit Europe over there. All those are European countries over there. Until they goddamn get closer, gonna got their Arabs in the middle. Then the whole side become Eurasia. Then they brainwash and fuck over the Africans. And then that's when they come over into the New World.
Due north.
To do their diligence and run us, indigenous aboriginals, off our shit.
while on the last few miles of the same march we had been traveling south, although we had all the time been traveling precisely in the same direction. In traveling the ice in these various directions, as I had done, I had allowed approximately 10 miles for possible errors in my observations, and at some moment during these marches and countermarches, I had passed over, or very near the point where the north and south, and east and west blend into one. Thus, starting in September 1909, a huge public debate, fueled by the newspapers, raged over who was truly first to the North Pole, with the New York Times showing unwavering support for Peary, and the New York Herald doing the same for Cook. The demand of proof in the form of navigational records was issued and subsequently avoided by both sides. Cook never produced any detailed original navigation records to substantiate his polar claim, and on December 21st, 1909, after
I can even go with that being a hill in the middle like that. But when it melt down at levels. If it was like that cartoon, the ice will melt down and the level turn to water and the water will flatten out.
examining what little evidence Cook did submit, a commission at the University of Copenhagen ruled there was no proof he had reached the pole. Cook's Inuit guides would also testify in handwritten documents that during their final push for the pole, they actually traveled south, not north, and never once did they travel out of sight of land. Meanwhile, Peary outright
Not once did they travel out of the sight of land, and that's all we seen was land on this picture. I just said it. Let's get it.
refused to submit his records for the Copenhagen Commission, forcing them to also conclude a lack of proof for his claim. Cook later alleged to have kept copies of his sextant navigation data, and in 1911 published some, only to be exposed as having an incorrect solar diameter during his calculations. The National Geographic Society held Peary's papers for decades, refusing researchers any access to them, and when finally independently examined, were also shown to be lacking. The released documentation listed only 3 solar observations without giving the date, no mention of which limb of the sun Peary observed, and claimed the star Betelgeuse was present when it could not have been detected by a sextant during that time of year. Peary never produced records of compass readings, observed data for
So he saw Betelgeuse, but Betelgeuse wouldn't have been able to be seen at that point. The star Betelgeuse. Let's get it.
steering, for his longitudinal position at any time, and for the final stage in his expedition, never took latitudinal or transversal readings, and had no accompanying colleagues trained in navigation who could confirm or deny his work. Even though Cook's own navigational data was found to be flawed, he would still publicly criticize Peary's alleged sextant readings, stating, "Mr. Peary's polar claim rests upon the impossible observations of a sun at an altitude of less than 7 degrees above the horizon." The 3
greatest fraud ever perpetrated in the world history. See what I'm saying? There it is right there in the paper right there. They've been far enough. The God, the globe, and the gravity. 3GD for life, man.
armchair geographers, seldom out of reach of dusty bookshelves, passed upon these worthless observations. Not one out of 100,000 honest sextant experts would credit such an observation as that upon which Mr. Peary's case rests, not even in home regions, where for centuries tables for corrections had been gathered. Not only were Cook and Peary's testimonies dubious and navigational records unsatisfactory, but the speeds claimed on their final pushes to the pole were also incredulous. Cook recorded on the 4th and 5th days before his support party left that even with full sledge loads, he was able to traverse 29 and 22 miles respectively those days, around double their usual distance covered. Yet his Inuit guide, Etukashuk, claimed that they remained in the same place for 2 nights. Polar researcher and author Randall Oskzemski, in
Put them on blast, indigenous people.
his book Frederick Cook and the Forgotten Pole, wrote that Cook had needed to invent additional mileage to make up the distance he said he had covered in reaching the pole, and to bring him back to land on a reasonable date. Some of this padding is found in distances claimed for days when they did not travel, but some could have been created by simply changing the units. Since his mileage figures came from a pedometer, it is likely that he originally recorded these figures as statute miles, pretending that they had really been nautical miles would add 15% to the distance. Peary's supposed speeds during his final push to the pole were even less believable than Cook's, allegedly averaging up to an implausible 71 miles per day. His last 5 marches, while accompanied by experienced navigator Captain Bob Bartlett, averaged no more than 13 miles per day. Once his last supporting party turned back and Captain Bartlett was ordered southward, Peary's alleged speeds immediately doubled for the next 5 marches. Then, Peary claimed during the final 8 days that his speed quadrupled from a base camp to the pole and back, covering 296 miles, 198 of them in just 4 days, giving an average of 49 miles a day. This figure, however, is before factoring many more miles of admitted detours due to navigation errors, drift, avoiding pressure ridges, and open water leads, which critics claim bring the figure closer to 71. No other explorer before or since has ever claimed such ridiculous speeds. Polar researcher and author Paul Simpson Housley wrote in his The Arctic Enigmas and Myths that those records failed to confirm that Peary reached his goal, and such observations could certainly have been faked. Peary fails to provide a detailed account in his diary. Moreover, he should have presented a well-kept log of his final approach that included checks on compass variation and on his latitude and longitude made by providing altitudes of the sun, planets, and stars at various locations. Polar pack ice is difficult terrain to traverse. The ice drift deviates from wind direction to the right by 28 degrees to 30 degrees in the northern hemisphere at a speed of 1/50th of the wind forcing it. Peary provided no wind speeds in either his diary or published reports. It is highly likely that he would be propelled to the left of his 70-degree meridian. His desire to reach the pole was certainly in excess of his intent to produce records. In addition, Peary's chronometer displayed an error of 10 minutes, and this would have influenced his heading. More doubt would eventually be cast on both Cook and Peary through public scrutiny. In 1906, Cook had previously claimed himself the first man to reach the summit of the tallest mountain in North America, Mount McKinley, only to be dethroned upon further investigation. It turned out the picture Cook provided as proof of his summit attainment was actually taken on a small outcrop on a ridge beside the Ruth Glacier, 19 miles away, and at only
Trickery, dickery, duck. They on the moon, they on Mars, they on the North Pole. Trickery, dickery.
5,338 feet high, nearly 15,000 feet lower than McKinley's true peak. Cook's sole companion during the 1906 climb, Ed Barrell, would also later sign an affidavit admitting that they had not reached the summit.
This nigga lied about the mountain, lied about the climb. Now you thought the nigga made it to the North Pole?
Including a map showing the location of what would become known as Fake Peak, where Cook's picture was actually taken. Belmore Brown, an experienced mountaineer who assisted Cook in the weeks before his alleged summit attainment, claimed McKinley too expansive and treacherous to have allowed Cook such quick access in the time frame given. He would later call Cook untrustworthy and state for the record that he, quote, knew that Dr. Cook had not climbed Mount McKinley the same way a New Yorker would know that no man could walk from the Brooklyn Bridge to Grant's Tomb in 10 minutes. Decades later, Cook would also be indicted and eventually charged and found guilty of 14 counts of fraud for startup oil companies he promoted and was sentenced to 14 years, 9 months in prison. As for Peary, his obsession with the pole caused him in the first 23 years of his marriage to spend only 3 with his wife and family, missing the birth and tragic death of his son. While in the Arctic, Peary cheated on his wife with a 14-year-old Inuit girl named Aliquis.
A 14-year-old Inuit? They just be fucking all the children and raping and doing what the fuck they want to do, huh? A 14-year-old Inuit?
Ina, who would eventually bear him 2 children named Kala and Carrie. During Peary's 7 long Arctic expeditions made between 1886 and 1909, A black man named Matthew Henson was technically more responsible for their successes than Peary himself. Henson took care of the other men, dogs, and supplies, spoke the Inuit language, pulled and fixed the sledges, and Henson even dragged Peary himself around.
Spoke the indigenous language.
During their final expedition, since Peary had lost 8 toes to frostbite on their previous journey and could barely walk. Even still, Peary had secretly planned to leave Henson and the Inuit guides behind for the final stint so that he could claim the poles solely for himself. His plan never came to fruition, however, and upon realizing he would have to share the fame, Peary immediately stopped speaking to Henson. The man who had engineered his success, saved his life on a previous expedition, and remained unwaveringly loyal to him for over 2 decades.
Fuck that nigger.
As Peary had once written in a letter to his mother, quote, "I must be the peer or superior of those about me to be comfortable." Historian Fergus Fleming called Peary, quote, "the most unpleasant man in the annals of polar exploration." And polar researcher and author Bo Riffenberg wrote that he, quote, "was perhaps the most self-serving, paranoid, arrogant, and mean-spirited of all 19th century explorers. He was suspicious of and hateful to those he considered rivals, either in actual geographical discovery or as heroic figures. He was condescending and insensitive to his subordinates, and he was ingratiating and servile to those he felt could help his quest for personal glory." Another man preparing for a North Pole expedition in 1909 was accomplished Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen. Upon hearing,
We'll be back. The truth don't need no help. We're gonna bust their ass up. Let's get a bam.